On the 8th of January, 1972, a nurse finishes her shift and vanishes without a trace. In Wren Hollow, the snow covered everything except the questions. If this story pulled you in, help us bring more like it into the light. Like, subscribe, and stay with us. The silence always hides more than it seems. The snow that night came heavier than the forecast predicted, but no one paid it much attention. In Wren Hollow, New York, winter wasn't an event, it was a condition, like time or grief. The flakes clung thick to the power lines and blanketed the sloped rooftops with a quiet that felt deliberate, like the town itself was holding its breath. The clock at St. Mary's Hospital ticked past 11 p.m. as Nurse Eileen Harper clocked out for what should have been an ordinary walk home. She was seen leaving through the side entrance, a shortcut she often used when the wind came in off the lake. A fellow nurse said she waved once, then pulled her coat tight around her and disappeared into the swirling white. That was it. No one heard a scream. No one reported seeing anything strange. No tire tracks on the road. No signs of a struggle. Just the soft hush of snowfall covering the world like a shroud. By morning, the town had moved on. A few colleagues noticed Eileen didn't clock in. A supervisor assumed she had called out. Her absence barely registered, not yet. The roads were bad. Phones were unreliable. People were used to waiting things out in the cold. But Nora Harper noticed. Eileen's younger sister lived just 6 blocks away and had made a ritual of calling her after late shifts, mostly to make sure the older sister had made it home safe. She tried twice that night, then a third time at 1:17 a.m. No answer. Still, she waited. It wasn't until noon the next day, when Eileen still hadn't returned, that Nora walked through the snow to the hospital herself. The nurses at St. Mary's were polite but distracted. They hadn't realized Eileen was missing until Nora arrived. One of them, a woman named Shirley, remembered Eileen mentioning a patient acting strangely the week before. He asked for her by name, she said, almost like a warning. Another staffer shrugged. People don't just vanish, he said, as if saying it would make it true. But people do vanish, and in Wren Hollow, they stay gone. The police report was thin, barely 2 pages long. Officer Michaels noted there were no signs of forced entry at her apartment, no known enemies, and no romantic entanglements. He ended the report with the words, "Possible runaway, no foul play suspected." That line became the barrier Nora would keep smashing her head against for the next 30 years. Inside Eileen's apartment, everything was untouched. Her wallet sat on the nightstand, untouched. Her purse was still in the closet, the bed was made, no packed bags, no notes. No trace of a woman planning to leave behind her life. Only one item seemed out of place, a single earring lying on the floor near the radiator, bent as if it had been stepped on. It didn't match any set Nora could find. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering every clue in a silent white erasure. Within days, the town turned its attention to the next thing, a power outage, a school closure, the slow march of everyday life. But for Nora, the date froze in place. The 8th of January, 1972. Not just the night her sister vanished, but the night the world tilted slightly, imperceptibly, and never quite righted itself again. Eileen Harper's final shift began like any other, quiet, unassuming, wrapped in the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the distant hiss of a radiator that never quite worked properly. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables from the kitchen downstairs, a blend that had become so familiar it barely registered. It was a Thursday night, the kind of night that settled into itself like a tired sigh. Most of the nurses moved slower after 10, their chatter dimming as the weight of the day pressed down. Eileen had been working the swing shift, noon to 11, her preferred hours. It let her sleep in, avoided the early rush, and gave her those last few moments of solitude walking home under stars instead of Sunday. That night, she spent her hours doing what she always did calmly, efficiently tending to her patients. She had 5 under her care. 3 were elderly men with chest complications, 1 a middle-aged woman recovering from surgery, and one was different. Room 209 had been admitted 2 days prior. No name, no identification. Just a man in his 40s, unconscious at first, found collapsed at a bus terminal outside town. When he woke, he spoke very little, offering vague answers, staring through the staff with unsettling stillness. Eileen had asked questions, as nurses do, where he was from, who to call, how he ended up there. His replies were disjointed, clipped, as if rehearsed. But there was nothing outwardly threatening. Still, a few staffers had asked for reassignment after being near him. Something about the way he watched them. Unblinking, measuring. Eileen didn't flinch. She treated him like any other patient, checking vitals, logging his medications, even staying a few extra minutes past her routine to sit silently in the chair beside him. He rarely spoke, but once, according to a note scribbled in the margin of her observation log, he had said something peculiar. "They know I'm here. You should go home early." That line was underlined. No further explanation. No timestamp. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Nurses passed in and out of the break room. A light flickered above the stairwell, again. The intercom made its usual low buzz before calling for assistance in the maternity wing. By 10:30, Eileen had signed off on her final chart and dropped her pen into her coat pocket, a habit she always had. She spoke briefly with Nurse Shirley about her sister's upcoming birthday. Shirley would later remember Eileen laughing soft, distracted as if her mind were already elsewhere. At 10:52 p.m., she walked down the south corridor, heels tapping faintly on the linoleum, her figure framed in the dull yellow of the hallway lights. She nodded to the security guard near the staff exit, who gave her a lazy wave in return. That was the last confirmed sighting. No camera, no witness beyond that one indifferent glance. In the locker room, her things remained untouched. A paperback novel still sat folded on a bench, pages curled. A thermos of now cold tea rested inside her cubby. She hadn't returned for them. The door closed behind her, and with it, so did any sense of ordinary. Outside, the snow had picked up. Heavy flakes descended in slow, muffling spirals, deadening every sound. The streets were near empty. No footsteps would survive the night, no trail to follow. Just the silence that comes before the unraveling of everything you thought you understood. The first night, Nora waited by the phone. Not because she was worried, not yet, but because she always did. It was routine. Eileen would call after her shift, just to say she got home safe, just to hear Nora's voice before bed. Sometimes they didn't talk long. Sometimes it was just, "It's cold tonight, and I'll see you Sunday." But silence that was foreign, silence had no shape. And by morning, it was pressing against the walls of Nora's kitchen, like something alive. She called the hospital at dawn. The woman who answered sounded groggy, annoyed at being asked if a nurse had made it home. Nora waited through the shuffle of phone transfers and vague mutterings before someone confirmed that yes, Eileen had left on time. Yes, she seemed fine. No one had heard from her since. It wasn't until Nora walked the 6 blocks to Eileen's apartment herself that the panic sharpened into something solid. The apartment was locked. Nora still had a spare key tucked into her wallet, folded between old receipts and a worn photo of the 2 of them as children. She opened the door with shaking hands and stepped into a place that felt eerily intact. The lights were off. The thermostat ticked softly in the corner. Her sister's shoes sat by the door. The kettle, still half full from the morning before, rested on the stove, untouched. Everything was still. But it was a stillness that didn't make sense. It didn't feel like absence. It felt like interruption. She called the police at noon. The desk sergeant was polite at first, then procedural. Eileen was an adult, he reminded her. It had only been one day. Maybe she'd gone to visit someone. Maybe she needed space. Maybe though he hesitated here, maybe she'd just left. She's not that kind of person, Nora replied. But the words felt thin, like paper. An officer was dispatched that afternoon, more out of courtesy than concern. Officer Michaels was young, no more than 30, with eyes that never quite met Nora's Mike. He took notes slowly, asking questions as if he already knew the answers. Any history of mental illness? Relationship troubles? Financial strain? Nora's no came sharp and steady. Eileen was reliable. Eileen was careful. Eileen didn't just vanish. He walked through the apartment, noted the lack of disturbance, the presence of her belongings. He scribbled down, no signs of forced entry, no signs of foul play. The case, if it could be called that, was logged with the classification everyone feared: voluntary disappearance. Nora watched the words form in his notebook and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter outside. That night, she sat in Eileen's apartment alone. She turned over the bent earring she'd found near the radiator and stared at the photo on the mantel. Eileen, in her nurse's uniform, smiling faintly, like someone who still believed the world made sense. The snow fell again, harder this time, and the town sank deeper into its own silence. Nora didn't sleep. She sat upright, listening for a knock that never came, a phone that didn't ring. 48 hours passed. The window of urgency closed. Whatever resources might have been used were quietly retracted. The case faded into the background hum of lost things. But for Nora, it had only just begun. She knew her sister better than anyone, knew the way she folded her clothes, the way she hummed when nervous, the way she never left things unfinished. Eileen hadn't run away. Nora would have felt it. A break in the tether between them. But that connection still pulled, taut and aching, stretched across an empty space she couldn't yet see. Something had happened. And whatever it was, it hadn't happened by choice. In Wren Hollow, people didn't talk loudly about things that mattered. Not in public, at least. They talked around them, dipped their words in suggestion and half-truths. Their voices always a few decibels too low to be recorded, but just loud enough to reach the person 2 stools down at the counter. When Eileen Harper disappeared, the town didn't erupt in panic. It tightened, quieted, as though it had been expecting something like this all along. At the Bluebird Diner, where the regulars drank weak coffee and read yesterday's paper like it still mattered, the whispers began no more than 2 days after Nora's call to the police. "I heard she took off with someone," one man muttered over a plate of eggs, his fork pausing mid-air. Nurse like that, all alone, always seemed like she was waiting for something to happen. Across from him, his companion shook his head, not in disagreement, but in discomfort. It was easier to speculate than to feel. The stories evolved quickly. Someone claimed to have seen Eileen arguing with a stranger outside the hospital 2 nights before. Another swore she'd seen her get into a blue truck, though the make and model changed with every telling. A teenager said she saw a man in a hospital gown wandering behind the church, muttering something about a nurse who disappeared into the wall. It became a kind of folklore, a winter tale passed along with shivers and smirks. But always, when Nora entered a room, the voices dropped. The eyes turned away. Curiosity didn't translate into compassion. Nora heard the whispers. They clung to her like frost. At the pharmacy, at the post office, even at church, people asked how she was holding up, but they never asked how they could help. They offered casseroles and pity, but never questions. Questions would imply the town cared about answers. Even those who knew Eileen, co-workers, neighbors, seemed caught in a strange reluctance. A nurse from St. Mary's crossed the street when she saw Nora coming. The landlord at Eileen's apartment, normally talkative, gave short, rehearsed answers. It was as if they'd all agreed, silently, to forget. But small towns don't forget. They just bury things beneath layers of politeness and snow. And Wren Hollow, for all its postcard charm, had always had a way of looking the other direction when things got too strange. A girl went missing in 2058 and was never found. A fire destroyed the town archives in 2063 accidental, they said. Even the hospital had its sealed rooms, its whispers about the old wing no longer in use. It wasn't until Nora began asking questions, real ones, that the resistance turned into avoidance. A retired orderly refused to meet her eyes when she asked about room 209. "You don't want to go poking around that," he muttered before walking off. Another nurse told her plainly, "Sometimes people leave, and that's all there is to it." But Nora knew better. She could feel it in the space Eileen had left behind, not an absence, but an echo. Something still reverberating beneath the silence. And in Wren Hollow, echoes had a way of bouncing back, twisted into something colder, something shaped like truth but brittle as ice. There were secrets here. She could feel them, not buried deep, but thinly veiled, as though the town was hoping no one would scrape the surface too hard. Because if they did, the ground might crack, and what lay beneath would be harder to explain than a simple disappearance. Nora Harper had never been the dramatic one. That was Eileen's role, at least when they were younger, brighter, bolder, more curious about the world beyond Wren Hollow. Nora was grounded, methodical, practical in the way children of small towns are taught to be. But when her sister vanished, something in Nora cracked, not loudly, but deeply. Grief didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, like cold through window panes. But obsession that came fast. It disguised itself as hope at first, something manageable. A belief that the system would work if she just pushed it hard enough. By the second week, Nora had covered her kitchen wall with a hand-drawn map of the town. Colored pins marked the places Eileen might have passed through that night. The hospital exit, the alley behind the florist, the shortcut through the cemetery path she sometimes took when the streets were too slick. She marked witness accounts in yellow, police responses in red. There weren't many of either. Each morning she stared at the grid as if willing it to shift, to reveal something missed. She started recording interviews in a lined notebook, the kind schoolteachers used for grades. The waitress at the diner who'd seen Eileen 2 days before the disappearance said she was quiet, but distracted. A neighbor swore she heard footsteps outside around midnight that night, but couldn't say what direction they came from. Nora didn't dismiss anything, even when it seemed absurd. Every word went in the notebook, even the rumors, especially the rumors. She learned to listen for what people didn't say, how their eyes drifted when they answered, how their voices lifted at the end of sentences, trying to sound confident. The police had stopped calling. There was nothing new, they said. No leads, no updates, and no manpower to chase a cold trail. They wouldn't file her as a missing person after 30 days, not without proof of foul play. Nora stopped calling them back. She no longer believed help would come from people with badges. Instead, she started walking Eileen's last known route every night at the same hour. At first, it was to make herself feel closer, as if walking in her sister's footsteps might stir some shared memory. But it became more than that, a ritual. She began to note things: how the streetlight on the corner flickered precisely every 7 seconds, how the snow drifted differently depending on which side of the road she walked, how her own shadow stretched too far when the moon was full. She borrowed books on psychology and forensics from the library. She requested hospital floor plans through clerical friends. She taught herself how to read microfilm, how to request public records, how to dig through the silence like it was sediment. Some days, she believed Eileen was still alive, trapped somewhere, maybe, or hiding. Other days, darker ones, she believed her sister's body was already gone, but her voice remained, caught in the spaces between the things people weren't saying. On those days, Nora left her tape recorder running at night, just in case. She believed in signs now. She believed in patterns. Hope, in the absence of answers, became something ritualistic. A candle always burned in Eileen's apartment, a light always left on. Her mail still collected in the same basket by the door. And Nora, the sister who once lived by logic, now filled her days with maps and murmurs, building something out of nothing because no one else would. It was no longer about finding Eileen. Not just that. It was about forcing the town to remember. About proving that people don't just vanish. Not really. Not without someone choosing to look away. The psychiatric ward at St. Mary's was tucked into the oldest part of the hospital, a wing with thick brick walls and windows that barely let in light. It was officially called South Wing 3B, but among the staff, it was simply the locked ward. Eileen had worked there briefly the year before she vanished, filling in on night shifts when the full-time nurse was out on leave. She didn't talk about it much afterward, just said it was different, then changed the subject. Nora had always taken that to mean it was draining, emotionally or otherwise. But months after the disappearance, when she managed to quietly obtain copies of Eileen's old work records, she noticed something strange. Several entries marked with an asterisk and no explanation. One of them fell on the 3rd of December, 1971, barely a month before she vanished. It took weeks of persistence, but Nora finally convinced a clerk in the records office to let her see the archived patient files. They were yellowed, handwritten, and stored in a cabinet behind a supply closet, as though the hospital had been hoping to forget them. She read through the files in silence, her eyes adjusting to the narrow cursive and fading ink. Most of the patients were long gone, either released, transferred, or deceased. One name kept resurfacing: Harold K., age 67. Admitted for paranoid delusions, chronic hallucinations, and violent episodes. Eileen's name was listed in his chart several times, always with the note, "Patient calms in her presence." One page stood out, not because of the notes typed by the attending physician, but because of what had been added later, scribbled in the margin in fine blue ink. Patient said, "She walks through the walls. No one sees her but me." The handwriting was Eileen's. Nora recognized it immediately. There was no context, no response from staff. Just the sentence, floating there like a warning no one took seriously. Nora flipped through the rest of Harold K.'s file. Most of it was routine until his discharge date, which had been scribbled out and changed twice. There was no discharge summary, no forwarding facility. He was simply gone. Desperate for more, Nora tracked down one of the old orderlies who had worked on the ward back then, a man named David Lutz, now in his 70s and living 2 towns over. She found him through a church bulletin, listed under a veterans support group. When she asked him about 3B, he grew quiet, his eyes suddenly far away. "That place wasn't right," he muttered. "Not just the patients, the walls, they seemed thinner there. Like you could hear things that weren't happening yet." He remembered Eileen, called her kind and steady. But he also remembered the night Harold K. started screaming uncontrollably, clawing at his mattress, yelling that they had taken her already. The date he gave, the 18th of December, was weeks before Eileen's disappearance. When asked who they were, Harold only repeated one word: "Below." Nora asked about the basement, but Lutz only shook his head. "That's where they moved the files, the ones they didn't want upstairs." Then he paused. "You know she wrote a report, right? Your sister. About one of the rooms. Said the door locked from the outside but had no key. Said she found a name scratched into the wall. But that report, it never showed up in her personnel file. No one at the hospital remembered it. No one admitted to reading it. And yet, there were whispers among the night staff about a room where the lights never stayed on, where patients claimed they could hear breathing even when the beds were empty. Eileen had asked to be reassigned after that shift. Her request was never processed. Nora left that day with a copy of the chart and the note in the margin, the only piece of her sister's handwriting left in a system that had scrubbed her from memory. She held it like evidence, though it felt more like a message. Whatever Eileen had seen in that locked ward, It hadn't let her go. Not then. Not now. The river that wound through Wren Hollow had always been slow-moving, dark with silt, its surface deceptively calm. It had no official name. Locals simply called it the Bend, for the way it curled like a crooked finger near the southern edge of town. In winter, it turned sluggish and glassy, reflecting only the gray sky above. In spring, it swelled and pulled debris downstream. Tree branches, beer cans, forgotten shoes. The river had seen things. It had swallowed things. And when Eileen disappeared, it became a suspect in its own quiet way. 3 days after the report was filed, the Wren Hollow Sheriff's Department organized a small-scale search along the river's edge. It wasn't much, a few volunteers, 2 uniformed deputies, and a bloodhound borrowed from the next county over. Nora watched them comb the banks with polite detachment. The men trudged through the brush with little urgency, their voices casual, as though searching for a lost set of keys rather than a missing woman. After 2 hours, one of the deputies held up something in a plastic bag, a dark leather nursing shoe, slick with mud and half submerged in a patch of reeds. The deputy made a face. "Could be hers," he said. Nora rushed forward. The shoe was Eileen's size, same brand. Same subtle wear near the toe, where her gait always curved a little to the right. But there was no second shoe. No footprints in the frost nearby. No signs of struggle. Just one shoe, alone. The next day, the sheriff filed it under unconfirmed personal item and returned it to the evidence room without processing it further. "Could be anyone's," he told Nora. "People throw things in the river all the time." She asked them to dredge it. They declined. Nora returned on her own the following day, wrapped in layers of wool and desperation, tracing the same shoreline the men had walked, but slower, more deliberate. The reeds whispered when the wind cut across them. Ice crusted along the shallows, cracking underfoot. She knelt by the bend, where the current thickened, and waited, staring at the water like it might offer something up if she was quiet enough. She began visiting the river daily, marking changes in the current, watching what floated by. Once, a child's mitten. Another time, a hairbrush, always singular, always incomplete. The river didn't give back everything. But it never stopped giving something. Nora learned its rhythm. The way it pulled harder after a thaw. The small eddies where things got caught. And she began to wonder not if Eileen had fallen in, but if something, or someone, had placed her near it with intent. In late February, a storm upstream sent debris tumbling through the channel. Logs, trash, even part of a broken door. Nora watched as the river delivered these fragments like confessions. She walked further than before, miles past the edge of town, where the bend widened into marshland. There, she found remnants of a fire pit, blackened and ringed with stones. Scattered around it were scraps of gauze, rusted safety pins, and a torn piece of fabric hospital blue, worn thin at the edges. She brought it to the sheriff. He glanced at it and shrugged. "Could be from the clinic. We dump supplies all the time." But his eyes didn't meet hers. And when she returned to the site a week later, the fire pit was gone. Stones scattered, ash buried beneath freshly turned soil. Someone had come after her. Someone had known. The river kept moving, indifferent to the questions pressed into its surface. It didn't care who watched or who waited. It took what it wanted. But sometimes, when it had nothing left to hide, it let things rise. Nora believed that. She had to, because whatever the water held, it hadn't finished speaking. Not yet. Nora once believed that truth could be found if you were willing to look hard enough. That the facts were there, buried maybe, but intact, waiting to be unearthed by someone persistent enough to dig. But by the spring of 1972, her belief in that idea began to unravel. She had spent months requesting documents, photocopies, official reports, hospital records. She kept her correspondence in a tidy folder, each letter carefully dated and catalogued. At first, she received polite denials, forms lost, privacy concerns cited, standard bureaucratic barriers. But soon, the responses became stranger. She requested Eileen's personnel file from St. Mary's, hoping to track down the full history of her assignments, evaluations, and any formal complaints or observations that might shed light on her final weeks. What came back was a thin manila envelope, far too light in her hands. Inside, just 4 pages. A basic employment application, a tax form, and 2 schedule logs. Gone were the performance reviews, the incident reports, and, most notably, the temporary assignment to the psychiatric ward in 3B. It was as if she had never worked there at all. When Nora followed up in person, she was met with blank stares and clipped explanations. The head of records claimed the department had done a routine purge that spring. "We don't keep everything forever," he said. "Not unless there's a legal reason." But Eileen had gone missing. Surely that qualified. He shrugged. "No formal investigation, no foul play on file. Not our responsibility." She moved on to the police. Her sister's report, the initial one she had filed in January, was missing its final page. The one she remembered signing herself. When she asked for the original handwriting, she was told the report had been transcribed into type and then discarded, part of an office-wide update to streamline filing. The deputy who'd taken the statement, Officer Michaels, had since transferred out of state. No forwarding address provided. Even the nursing board, a last-ditch effort, had gaps in their documentation. According to their database, Eileen had never renewed her license in 1972, something Nora knew she'd done every December without fail. There was no record of payment, no paperwork, no certification. It was as if someone had pressed delete, methodically, one piece at a time. At first, Nora thought it was incompetence, mismanagement, apathy. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. The missing files weren't random, they were specific. Anything tied to the psychiatric wing, to Eileen's final days, or to patient interactions that might have raised questions, had vanished. Like pages torn out of a book in a deliberate sequence, just enough to obscure the plot. One night, alone in her apartment, Nora laid out what she had: a timeline with gaping holes, a map with unanswered pins. She stared at the documents not as records, but as artifacts of absence. What was missing said more than what remained. And it struck her someone had started erasing her sister before she even disappeared. But why? That question grew louder in her mind than any rumor ever had. Not just what happened to Eileen, but what she might have uncovered. What did she see in that locked ward? What did she write down that someone couldn't afford to keep on record? In the weeks that followed, she returned to the hospital records office more than once. Sometimes, she just stood there, watching clerks shuffle paper and refile cabinets that now felt like mausoleums of selective memory. She stopped asking to see files. She started asking who had access, who ordered purges, who had keys. There were no answers, but there was movement. Every time she pressed, something shifted quietly behind closed doors, and every time she turned around, a little more had disappeared. It arrived on a Thursday, 10 years to the week since Eileen vanished. The envelope was thin, yellowing slightly at the edges, and bore no return address. Just Nora's name, handwritten in a blocky, deliberate scrawl. No postage stamp, no markings. It hadn't come through the post. It had been slipped into her mailbox by hand. She found it after returning home from her shift at the town library, tucked between a stack of coupons and a notice for road work. Her name looked strange in that unfamiliar ink, too formal, too stiff, like a label on a file that someone wanted to forget. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded once. The words were typed, not handwritten. There was no greeting, no signature. Just a message, short and blunt. She knew too much. Stop digging or you'll end up where she did. And underneath, in smaller font, almost like a footnote, it wasn't a random patient. Ask about the man who never existed. Nora read it 3 times, standing at her kitchen counter. The 4th time, she sat down. The 5th, she cried. She had received strange looks and casual warnings before. Little things. A glance that lingered too long. A nurse who changed the subject too fast. But this was different. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't ambient silence or whispered neglect. This was a threat. And someone had gone to the trouble of delivering it in person. For days afterward, she watched from behind her curtains, alert to every passing car, every footstep on the porch. But no one came. The envelope held no fingerprints, the paper no watermark. When she brought it to the sheriff's office, the deputy on duty gave it a single glance and offered a shrug that bordered on pity. "Crank stuff. People like to stir up old ghosts," he said. "You should let it go, for your own good." She didn't let it go. But she didn't share the letter either. Not with friends. Not with her parents, who by then had long since resigned themselves to silence. She placed it in a manila folder, labeled it with the date, and buried it at the back of a filing cabinet behind utility bills and tax returns. For a while, she tried to forget it was there. But of course, she didn't. Instead, the letter became a turning point, though not in the way most would expect. It didn't make her stop digging. It made her dig differently. She no longer asked direct questions. She stopped making noise. She learned how to wait, how to listen for things people said when they didn't think they were being watched. She copied documents without signing request forms. She made friends with janitors, not doctors. She read old directories, scanned, archived building plans, began to memorize names and dates that no longer appeared in any official capacity. And always, in the back of her mind, the words circled like a warning and a confirmation all at once. She knew too much. What had Eileen seen? What had she told the wrong person, or the right one? The letter remained hidden for 2 decades. By the time the paper had begun to fade, the message still burned, etched into Nora's daily life like a scar she refused to cover. She never spoke of it, never hinted. But she never stopped tracing its echo. And when, years later, something finally surfaced, something buried in a place no one had looked in decades, the letter was the first thing she unfolded, hands trembling, breath held, reading it once more like a prophecy that had always known how the story would end. Nora found the photograph by accident. It was the summer of 1986, 14 years after Eileen vanished, and she was cleaning out her parents' attic, sorting through boxes no one had touched in years. Her father had passed the month before, and her mother, fading in memory and voice, was being moved into assisted care. Nora had already donated most of Eileen's belongings, save for one box she had held onto. Labeled simply Misk E. It was filled with unremarkable remnants, receipts, hair ties, half-used notebooks. The kinds of things no one would miss unless they belonged to someone who had disappeared. The Polaroid was tucked between the pages of a daily planner from 1971. It slipped out when Nora opened it, landing face down on the wooden floor. She almost didn't notice it at first, mistaking it for a blank scrap of paper. But when she turned it over, a slow, crawling unease settled over her. It was a photo of the hospital break room. Eileen stood near the coffee machine, smiling faintly, mid-turn, as if caught off guard by whoever took the picture. The foreground was blurred, as if the lens had focused too late. But in the background, half shadowed by a flickering fluorescent light, was a man. His features were obscured, not just by the poor resolution, but by motion. He was either walking into or away from the room, hard to tell. Only his outline was visible, but even that felt wrong. His posture too stiff, his limbs slightly out of proportion, like someone who didn't quite belong in the frame. Nora stared at it for a long time. She turned it over, checked the back. No date, no writing, no explanation. She flipped through the planner again, hoping for a clue, a scribbled name, an event marked. But the pages were mostly empty. A few work notes, grocery lists, An appointment crossed out in December. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that explained why Eileen had kept the photo hidden. Because hidden it was. The drawer where she'd stored the planner had been nearly empty when Nora first searched the apartment back in 1972. She hadn't found the photograph then. It must have been placed there after, or perhaps it had been mistucked too far back to be noticed. But even then, the question pressed itself into her mind with unbearable weight. Why hadn't Eileen ever mentioned it? And more haunting still, why had she never shown it to anyone? Nora brought the photograph to the police again, this time to a new detective in town. He scanned it, uninterested. "Lots of people work at hospitals," he said, shrugging. "Might have just been some maintenance guy." But he couldn't identify the man, no one could. And when Nora began asking former staff, those still in Wren Hollow either didn't recognize the figure or claimed they remembered someone like that but never knew his name. One nurse, older now and long retired, looked at the photo and went very still. "That man," she whispered, "he wasn't on staff. He just started showing up. No ID, no file. Said he was with administration, but I never saw him talk to anyone above shift managers. And then he was gone." The photograph became an artifact in Nora's investigation, something she never quite knew what to do with. She kept it in a sealed envelope, hidden in the same drawer where she kept the anonymous letter. Together, they felt like pieces of something larger, edges of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. The man in the photograph was a ghost, a smudge in the margins of her sister's life. But even a ghost leaves footprints if you know where to look. And Nora was learning to look in the places no one else dared. By 1992, the world had shifted in ways both vast and subtle. The hospital had added a new wing. The Bluebird Diner had changed owners, then menus, then hours. The sidewalks had cracked deeper, the trees grown taller, and a generation of children had come of age. Never hearing the name Eileen Harper unless it slipped from an old woman's lips at church. In Wren Hollow, time didn't erase things. It layered them, like paint applied too thickly, one coat dulling the last until even the memory of the original color felt imagined. But for Nora, nothing had changed. She still lived in the same house. The porch sagged more than it used to, the kitchen tiles had chipped, and one of the upstairs windows refused to open, swollen permanently by decades of damp seasons. Her husband had left 3 years earlier not with anger, but with exhaustion. He'd once said he admired her determination, called it brave. But over time, the admiration curdled into something heavier. Her grief, he told her, had become the third person in their marriage. Eventually, it became the only one. Her children had grown, 2 daughters, both now in their 20s. They loved her, but from a distance, phone calls instead of visits. Holiday cards without return addresses. Nora didn't blame them. They'd spent their childhoods in the shadow of a woman who was always looking elsewhere. And what child can compete with a ghost? Still, Nora remained. The ritual never stopped. Every the 8th of January, she lit the same candle, placed the same photograph by the window. Eileen, age 29, smiling softly with wind-tangled hair. She continued her walks through the town, the same paths she'd walked 20 years earlier. She noted new street signs, fresh construction, but always returned to the same markers. The alley behind the hospital, the edge of the river, the apartment building that now housed strangers. She became part of the scenery, the quiet woman with the slow, watchful eyes and the ever-present notebook. People stopped asking how she was doing. Some had moved away, others had grown used to her silence. She was polite, but distant. Her world narrowed to routines: work, research, memory. She volunteered at the library part-time, mostly to stay close to the archives. She knew every article, every obit, every public notice that mentioned St. Mary's or missing persons, or unexplained hospital transfers. She clipped them, filed them, cross-referenced them. It was a language only she spoke now. Every so often, a new face in town would ask about the woman who vanished. Nora would catch wind of it, overhear it at the grocer, or through the town bulletin board. But even then, the story was wrong. People remembered it as an urban legend. "Didn't she just leave town?" someone once said at a school board meeting. "She was depressed, I think." Nora didn't correct them. What was the point? Truth had become a private language, too sacred to share with those who'd stopped listening long ago. She kept everything, every file, every photo, every whisper. Her filing cabinet was now locked with a key she wore around her neck. The anonymous letter was still folded where it had always been. The photograph of the unknown man had faded slightly around the edges, but the mystery remained untouched. It pulsed, steady as ever, beneath the wallpaper of her life. Time had done what it always does, it reshaped the narrative for everyone else. But for Nora, 20 years had not brought peace. Only more questions. And an ache that refused to age, refused to settle. It had simply become part of her. A second heartbeat. A shadow she no longer stepped out of. The call came on a rain-soaked Thursday in April. The kind of gray, low-hanging day that made even the clock seem reluctant to move. Nora hadn't expected to hear her mother's name again in any official capacity. She had passed quietly the month before, her final years blurred by a gentle, dissolving forgetfulness. The voice on the other end of the line was thin, slightly mechanical, like it had been repeating the same script for decades. It was from a storage facility on the outskirts of Wren Hollow Pine Ridge Self-Storage, tucked behind an old lumber yard off Route 6. The man explained that a key had been found among her mother's effects. A key, and a folded piece of paper with the number 43 scrawled in red ink. When the facility traced the record, they found the locker had been paid for in full, year after year, but had never once been opened. Not since 1972. Nora's breath caught. She didn't ask why it had taken them this long to reach out. She didn't care. By the time she arrived, dusk was settling over the hills, the rain tapering to a fine mist that clung to her coat and hair. The facility was silent, except for the buzz of a single overhead light near the office. The attendant didn't ask questions. He simply led her to the unit and handed her the key. Her fingers trembled as she turned it in the lock, the metal resisting for a moment before yielding with a heavy click. The door groaned upward, revealing the untouched air of another lifetime. Inside, dust floated in lazy spirals. The locker was small, barely larger than a walk-in closet, and filled with only a few carefully arranged boxes. No furniture, no clutter, just storage meant to be remembered. Nora stepped in slowly, her shoes echoing on the concrete floor. The smell was familiar: aged paper, old wood, the faintest trace of lavender soap. Eileen. The first box held clothing. A nurse's uniform, precisely folded. A winter coat Nora remembered from a photograph. A pair of gloves with one finger worn thin. Beneath them, a small cedar box containing keepsakes, bracelets, pressed flowers, a book of poetry with underlined passages in Eileen's steady hand. Nora moved carefully, reverently, as if disturbing the order might unravel whatever invisible thread had kept these things hidden for so long. Another box held documents, some medical, some personal. Receipts, appointment cards, and several pages. Nora recognized immediately as copies of Eileen's handwritten notes. Among them were dated observations from the psychiatric ward entries that had never appeared in her official personnel file. One note, barely legible from water damage, read, "Patient 209 mentioned the wall again. Asked if I saw her too, starting to wonder what he knows." There was no patient file to match. But Nora had heard the number before. At the bottom of the final box was a journal. Leather-bound, edges frayed, the clasp rusted. Eileen's name was etched into the cover in faint gold leaf. Nora opened it slowly, the pages stiff with age. Inside were entries dated from October 1971 to early January 1972. They were fragmented, some sentences cut short, others densely written, almost frantic. The last entry ended mid-sentence. "If anything happens to me, it will be because of..." It stopped there, no signature, no explanation. Nora sat down on the floor of the locker, her back against the cold metal wall, and held the journal in her lap. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. The rain had returned, tapping against the tin roof like a metronome counting down to something she couldn't yet name. For 20 years, she'd chased shadows. And now, finally, one of them had turned around. Not with answers, but with pieces. Evidence of a story that someone had tried to bury under layers of time and silence. But the locker had waited. Eileen had waited. And now, Nora was listening. The return to the site came quietly, without fanfare or press conferences. It was a controlled effort, part investigation, part damage control. After the discovery of Daniel Morgan's remains and the recovery of the disturbing photographs and audio, the Park Service, in coordination with federal authorities, initiated a deeper sweep of the area. They wanted answers. Or, at the very least, a narrative that could close the file without raising more questions. Reporters, too, had started arriving in nearby towns. Word had leaked, as it always does. A hiker found strung up in the forest like an offering. Strange symbols carved into bark. Whispers on a recording. These things didn't stay quiet for long. Officially, no one acknowledged the details, but rumors filled the vacuum with unsettling precision. On a gray morning in mid-June, a convoy of SUVs, Forest Service trucks, and an unmarked black van made its way toward the edge of Tolmie Ridge. The goal: a detailed forensic survey of the area where Daniel had been found. Drones were launched early, mapping the terrain from above with infrared and high-resolution imaging. The forest from the air looked calm, an undisturbed sea of green, but it didn't stay that way for long. About half a mile from the original site, one drone picked up something unusual. The faint remains of a fire ring, blackened stones in a rough circle. Around it, 4 makeshift lean-tos had been constructed, now sagging with rot and moss. Primitive shelters, built from deadfall and lashed together with what looked like vines or animal sinew. No signs of recent use, but they hadn't been abandoned long. Maybe months. Maybe less. Investigators on foot reached the spot later that afternoon. It was deeper than any trail had gone, tucked into a hollow thick with lichen and old growth. The air there felt dense, the temperature oddly cooler. As they moved closer, they saw more details. Bones scattered near one of the shelters, some animal, but not all. A forensic anthropologist later confirmed at least 2 were human. A section of jawbone with 2 teeth still intact. A femur cracked lengthwise. No signs of burial or care. Just discarded. The most disturbing discoveries, however, were the carvings. Nearly every tree within a 30-foot radius bore some kind of mark. Symbols carved deep into the bark with crude tools. Spirals within spirals. Triangles with slit-like lines through the center. And elongated figures stick-like shapes with disproportionately long limbs and headless torsos. None of the markings matched known indigenous symbology or wildlife tags. Linguists and cultural historians consulted by the authorities were stumped. "This isn't a language," one expert noted, "it's an obsession." Beneath one particularly massive cedar, they found what looked like an altar, a flat stone partially buried, its surface etched with the same jagged lines. Dried moss and broken twigs littered the top, but underneath was a smear of something long dried and reddish-brown. Lab tests would later confirm it was blood, though whether human or animal couldn't be determined. The discovery of the campsite shifted the narrative. If Daniel had stumbled upon this place, whatever it was, he may not have been alone. The idea of a cult was floated, an off-grid group, perhaps with violent tendencies. It fit better in official paperwork than unknown entity or ritualistic forest phenomenon. But even that explanation felt stretched. There was no sign of life, no tracks, No food remains, no gear. Just the remnants of something primal. Something that had been there, and then vanished. That night, after the team returned to base camp, one of the drone operators reviewed flight footage from earlier that day. At timestamp 4 hours 13 minutes and 57 seconds, as the drone banked over the ridge and turned toward the clearing, a figure appeared just for a moment standing at the tree line. Still, upright, watching. When the footage was rewound and zoomed in, the figure was gone. Just trees. And silence. Nora had seen the name before once in a letter Eileen had written in late 1971, folded neatly into a holiday card that never got mailed. It was a casual mention, almost an afterthought. Dr. Maris said I should take some time off, but I think he's just trying to keep me out of 3B for a while. At the time, Nora had read it and assumed it referred to one of Eileen's supervisors, perhaps a well-meaning doctor trying to spare her the toll of psychiatric work. But after the cassette, after the voice in the dark saying, "They're watching me," Nora returned to the name with fresh urgency. She began by calling Street Mary's ex, expecting to be stonewalled. But this time, the staff were different. The hospital had changed hands twice in the years since Eileen's disappearance. Most of the old employees were gone, and the new administration, while disinterested, wasn't particularly protective. When she asked about Dr. Jonathan Maris, there was a pause, a brief search. Then, "Doesn't look like we have anyone by that name on record." "Are you sure he worked here?" She was sure. Undeterred, Nora expanded her search. She pulled medical board records from Albany and Buffalo, then the National Registry. Nothing. No license, no academic trail, no residency or certifications. She checked birth records, census logs, even old Wren Hollow directories from the early 72nd. The name didn't appear anywhere. It was as if he'd materialized at Street Mary's, existed only within its walls, and vanished the moment Eileen did. But people had seen him. When she began reaching out again to former staff, the few who agreed to speak remembered the name. They remembered a man in his late 30s, quiet, clean-cut, always in a dark tie, always working nights. He wasn't warm, they said, but he wasn't cold either, just distant, professional. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. One nurse recalled him attending a staff Christmas party in 1971. "He just stood by the window the whole time," she said. "Didn't eat, didn't smile. Like he was watching something outside no one else could see." A janitor from that time claimed he'd seen Dr. Maris entering the sealed-off west corridor of 3B late at night, alone, despite there being no patients assigned to that area. When asked who gave him access, the man only said, "No one questioned the doctors back then, especially not ones who looked like they belonged." Nora pressed harder. She contacted the state archives, trying to locate any payroll records, hospital staff rosters, anything that would place Maris in the system. What she got instead was a curious redaction. A hospital personnel report from 1972, with several blacked-out names under temporary psychiatric consultants. No explanation, no justification. Just black ink over a decade of silence. That was the moment something inside her shifted. Up until then, the story had always bent toward loss, toward absence, neglect, forgetting. But this was active, intentional. Someone had gone through great effort to erase him, to scrub his existence, not just from files, but from memory. And yet, traces remained, whispers, fragments. The ghost of a man who had worn a white coat and spoken calmly and advised her sister to stop asking questions. The last reported sighting of Dr. Jonathan Maris was from a former receptionist who claimed he came to the hospital in January 1973 to collect a box from his office. No one saw him after that. The office was cleared out, the nameplate removed. When Nora asked what had been in the box, the receptionist simply said, "Tapes, I think. And folders." But it was years ago. The man with no birth certificate, no license, No address, no trace. But Eileen had written his name. Eileen had spoken of him. And now Nora had too. The blueprint was folded into thirds, brittle at the edges, its corners yellowed by age and moisture. Nora found it in the town's planning office, filed under a renovation permit dated 1974. She hadn't been looking for it. Not directly. She had come to cross-reference building permits with staffing changes, hoping for some thin connective thread that might lead her back to Dr. Maris. But as she turned the pages of faded microfiche and stared at the grainy photocopies of architectural drawings, one detail on the hospital's map pulled her in with a gravity she couldn't explain. There, in light pencil and red ink, was a section beneath the west wing labeled Utility Access, Secondary Sublevel, to be sealed. It was positioned directly below 3B, the psychiatric ward where Eileen had once worked. The notation struck her like a warning. Sublevel? There had never been mention of a sublevel in any hospital brochure or official floor plan. She scanned further. In the margin, an annotation read, "Access tunnel permanently closed the 10th of January, 1972. Nora stared at the date. That was 2 days after Eileen disappeared. The discovery set her body buzzing with a strange, cold clarity. She copied the blueprint, tracing it with shaking fingers, noting every stairwell, every corridor, every passageway that now no longer existed. The sublevel had been accessed through a back stairwell, marked maintenance only. According to the blueprint, that stairwell had been bricked over during renovations the following year. No reason provided. No mention of what had prompted the closure. She returned to the hospital that afternoon, posing as a curious citizen interested in the historic layout of the building. The front receptionist, a teenage volunteer with little knowledge and even less suspicion, granted her a visitor badge. Nora moved through the halls like a shadow, counting doors, matching the blueprint to the actual structure. When she reached the west wing, now converted into storage space, her heart slowed to a crawl. The door where the stairwell should have been was gone. In its place was smooth drywall, painted the same bland beige as the rest of the corridor. But Nora ran her hand along it, pressing gently. The rhythm of the wall was Wren Hollow in one section, like a breath waiting to be exhaled. She asked a janitor if he knew what used to be there. The man, in his 60s and clearly nearing retirement, narrowed his eyes. "Old stairwell," he muttered. "Used to lead down to the furnace room, I think. They sealed it years ago, said it was a fire hazard. But the furnace had long since been moved. The current one was in the North Annex, installed in 1981. Nora knew this. She'd already read the installation permits. Why, then, had they closed off a stairwell beneath the psychiatric ward, just days after a nurse vanished? Why seal it completely and erase it from public documents? The blueprint didn't lie. Someone had deliberately hidden that space. Whether it was storage, a treatment area, or something else entirely, Nora couldn't say. But the fact it had been buried literally and bureaucratically spoke volumes. She returned home and pinned the copied blueprint to her wall beside Eileen's journal, the photograph, the letter, the cassette tape. A new line connected them now, running downward into the earth. Whatever was beneath the west wing had not been forgotten. It had been erased. The call came from someone. Nora barely remembered Michael Denning, a local journalist who had once interviewed her in the early 80s for a retrospective on cold cases in upstate New York. At the time, he'd been young, eager, with the kind of journalistic idealism that didn't last long in towns like Wren Hollow. She hadn't heard from him in over a decade. When he called, his voice had the edge of someone who had stumbled across something that didn't want to be found. "I was going through old police archives for a piece I'm writing," he said, "on misfiled evidence in unsolved cases. And I found something I think you need to see." They met at a cafe just outside town, one that didn't ask questions and didn't play music too loud. Denning was older now, grayer, eyes worn but sharp. He pulled a folder from his satchel, and slid it across the table with the kind of caution usually reserved for fragile things. Inside, Nora found a photograph. Her breath caught before her mind had time to catch up. It was the same one, the blurry Polaroid she had discovered years ago in Eileen's planner. The same grainy image of her sister near the hospital coffee machine, mid-turn, eyes half laughing. And in the background, the same figure, shadowed, unclear, standing just beyond the fluorescent light, half in motion, half in focus. The man she had never identified. The man who, according to every official record, had never existed. But this copy was different. This one had police tags, archival notations in faded pencil at the bottom right corner, and stamped across the back in red ink, "Do not file." Beneath that, a second stamp, nearly illegible, "Scheduled for destruction." Nora looked up. Where did this come from? Denning leaned in, lowering his voice. It was inside an envelope misfiled in a burglary case from 2074. Wrong case number, wrong folder. I don't think anyone's seen it since then. Except maybe whoever marked it. Why would they destroy it? That's what I wanted to ask you. She told him about the original photo. About where she'd found it, how it had been buried in Eileen's belongings, never meant for anyone else's eyes. The photo she had never shared publicly, never submitted to the authorities. She had kept it hidden, convinced it was part of something larger, something dangerous. And now here it was again, as if summoned. As if the silence around it had finally cracked. Nora studied the markings. The date on the back said the 14th of January, 1972, 6 days after Eileen disappeared. The handwriting was hurried, almost shaky. No signature, no initials. This wasn't mishandled, she said slowly. This was buried. Denning nodded. Whatever this is, someone didn't want it in the official record. And someone else forgot to follow through. The reappearance of the photo opened a new kind of void confirmation, not just that something had been hidden, but that it had once been known. That someone within the police department had seen this photo, understood its implications, and made the choice to suppress it. It had been scheduled for destruction. Someone had written those words. Someone who had seen the man in the background and decided no one else should. Nora left the cafe with the photograph pressed flat between her hands. It felt heavier now. Like it had been waiting all these years for the right eyes to see it again. Not lost. Not forgotten. Just postponed. The air felt different that morning, crisper than she remembered, though the calendar said it was summer. Emily stood at the trailhead, staring up at the dense canopy of Mount Rainier's western woods, the same path Daniel had taken a year ago to the day. She hadn't wanted to come. Every part of her resisted it. But something deeper than logic had pulled her here. Something that had lingered in the background of her life for the last 12 months, whispering through sleepless nights and the brittle silence that came from not knowing. It wasn't closure she was seeking. She knew by now there was no such thing. It was acknowledgement. A way to say goodbye, even if the mountain had long since stolen her brother's voice. The forest was quieter than she remembered, unnaturally so. She walked with steady steps, each one heavy with memory. She passed the marker where his car had been found. The moss-covered logs he'd likely stepped over. The first fork in the trail, the one leading toward Tolmy Ridge, now cordoned off with a crude wooden barricade and a warning sign. Unmaintained trail. Do not enter. She kept going anyway. It had taken weeks of pleading with park officials and pulling favors just to get permission to hike into the area again. She wasn't alone. 2 rangers waited back at the trailhead, instructed to give her space but to monitor her from a distance. She didn't care. This was her moment. Her brother's moment. She reached the grove just before noon, the sun high but dulled by the thick branches overhead. The place where they'd found Daniel's body was empty now. The rope long gone. The trees stripped of their markings by officials trying to erase what had happened. But the atmosphere remained thick, heavy with something unsaid, something that clung to the bark and soil like a stain too deep to scrub away. Emily sat on a fallen log near the base of the largest tree and opened her pack. She pulled out a photo Daniel on his last birthday, smiling, wind-blown, alive, and a small pendant he used to wear, the one she'd found in his nightstand drawer after he vanished. She placed both at the base of the tree, her hands trembling only slightly. "I hope you found peace," she whispered. "Wherever you are." The wind moved through the trees then, not a gust, but something slower, like breath. The leaves shifted with a soft rustle, and for a moment, everything held still. Time, sound, even thought. That's when she saw it. Across the clearing, just beyond the trees, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly tall and still, half hidden in the shadowed undergrowth. At first, she thought it was a tree itself, a trick of the light, but her instincts knew better. There was a shape to it, shoulders too broad, arms too long, no face, not one she could see. But it was watching her, of that she was certain. Her breath caught. She blinked, and it was gone. No crack of twigs, no shuffle of movement, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. The clearing returned to silence. The wind died. She didn't scream, didn't run. She simply rose, slowly, and backed away from the tree. Her heart thundered, her palms slick with sweat, but her steps were measured. She walked until the trees began to thin, until the barricade came into view, and the rangers nodded at her from the distance. She didn't tell them what she saw. Some things weren't meant to be spoken aloud. Not here. Not where the mountain listens. The snow had returned, blanketing Wren Hollow in that same muted hush it wore the night Eileen disappeared. 30 years had passed, and yet the air tasted the same, sharp, metallic, tinged with the quiet that comes just before everything changes. Nora sat in her living room, a fire flickering low in the hearth, though she barely felt its warmth. On her lap, wrapped in a cotton cloth, lay the journal. Eileen's journal. The last of it. She had read through most of the recovered pages in the days since finding the grave. Some were too damaged to make sense of. Others stopped abruptly mid-thought, as if Eileen had written in haste or fear, or both. But the last entry, still intact, still whole, sat heavy in Nora's hands. She hadn't turned to it yet, not until now. She unwrapped the cloth with a reverence usually reserved for sacred things. The page was brittle but legible. Eileen's handwriting was tighter than usual, the ink darker, almost as if she had pressed harder into the page. As though she knew this would be the one that mattered most. "If you're reading this, I didn't leave." Nora read the words aloud, her voice barely more than a whisper, and they echoed through the quiet of the room like a confession meant for more than just her. "I didn't run. I didn't disappear. I was taken or warned or something in between. I don't know anymore what's real. The hospital isn't just a hospital. They built it over something, or someone. The staff, they won't talk, but they know. They walk past certain doors and pretend they aren't there. They file reports they never send. They burn things, I've seen it." The fire popped softly, a log shifting in the grate. "There's a presence. She's not a story. She's not a patient. She watches, she moves through walls. Sometimes I hear her behind me. Sometimes I feel her watching while I sleep. And then there's him, Maris. He talks in riddles. He says she's a symptom. I think he's wrong. I think she's a witness." Nora paused, her breath caught between disbelief and dread. The firelight danced across the ink like it was still wet. "They warned me to stop asking. I didn't. I started recording things. I started writing more. I thought if I got it all down, maybe someone would believe me. Maybe you, Nora. I hope it's you." The next lines were messier, as though written in the dark. "If you find this, please know I tried to come back. I tried to stay, but it got too close. And I think they're going to erase me. Not just my name, but everything I've ever done. My whole life, filed away and set on fire. But if you're reading this, it didn't work. I'm still here, somewhere. The last line was simple, centered on the page, underlined twice. If you're reading this, I didn't leave. Nora closed the journal slowly, hands trembling but sure. Outside, the snow fell thick against the window pane, each flake a small hush settling over the world. No great mystery had been solved. No grand conspiracy unveiled in full. There would be no arrests, no confessions, no triumphant moment of justice. But Eileen had spoken. And in her voice, Nora found something she hadn't known. She was still searching for not answers, but a kind of return. A way to hold her sister again, if only in words, in pages, in the space between sentences that had waited 3 decades to be read. The past remained fractured, incomplete, but now it had weight, now it had proof, and sometimes that was enough. The fire burned low, the journal resting on Nora's lap like a closing prayer. Outside, the snow kept falling, and this time she let it.